Welcome to the Property Development Book Club podcast. Please be advised that panel members are expressing their own views and opinions, which should not be construed as advice. The audience must carry out their own research and consult an appointed professional for advice.
Today we're talking about property development finance. I'm your host, I'm ADEWOLE, and I'm joined by some amazing group of professionals. Development finance to many people means many different things, but this conversation is going to try to demystify what development finance is and how the likes of property developers, whether it's small or large, can tap into using leverage to maximize their returns on working on development schemes. So I would like to then introduce you or allow the guests to introduce themselves. So I'll start with you, Kazim, please.
Sure. Hi, I'm Kazim Afolabi. I work for BBS Capital as a director in the financing group. We essentially arrange financing for developers and property professionals, propcos, or investors alike.
Perfect. Thank you. Over to you.
Hi, I'm AJAYI. I'm a quantity surveyor, chartered quantity surveyor, regional director at Chorus Group. I've carried out the role of monitoring surveyor on behalf of a number of funds, so I'm here in that capacity.
Perfect. Over to you.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Wong. I'm a relationship director at Paragon Development Finance, and we fund developments from anywhere from £400,000 all the way up to 35 million.
Perfect. So I think that the reason why this conversation is important, because you're joined by the people the banks, the people that can arrange the financing, and the people that are going to monitor the finance, but each person's role will be exploring it shortly. So the first question I have for today is for Ray, and it's just for you to just briefly explain what is development finance.
Yeah, so development finance is essentially a loan facility where we are assisting with acquisition and development of a property scheme. It could also be a refurbishment as well. There's quite a few lenders in the space. I mean, at Paragon we mainly residential led, but we offer also different sectors as well. So it could be purpose-built student accommodation, supported living, retirement villages, built to rent as well. So it's quite a vast asset class that we work with. And again, it's not just banks that offer this facility. It's that there's a lot more competition in the space now. Peer-to-peer lenders, debt funds, institutional capital as well. So it really is quite encompassing and quite competitive market at the moment.
And you've got high net worth individuals that also do...
And private, and private money as well.
Private money as well. And there's a lot of controversy around that, but we're not going to explore it at this point, but we will at some point in this discussion. So the next question I have, and this is for Kazim, and it was, the question is, what is a capital stack and what are the key ingredients that go into it?
Sure. So a capital stack, think of it as a pie. You're looking to go from the overall stack of, or the pie in terms of how the overall project is financed. So you will have a senior stack, could have a mezzanine stack, and you can have the actual equity. And you can structure this in many different ways. So a senior stack is essentially from 0 to 50 or 60%, depending on how you and who the sponsor is. The mezzanine stack is essentially the middle stack, which is a little bit more risky. So we'll appreciate again more return in terms of the overall pie. And then the final chunk is the equity, which is the developer or the investor who's helping the development go. And so the way that a capital stack or a way that a pie could be cut, as you know, can be cut in many different pieces. Ray's role typically will come from the senior stack. In some cases may even go up to what we call stretch senior, which is just essentially a percentage of the leverage curve of the overall 100% of the pie.
Yeah, so just to clarify on that, just for the listeners, in terms of you mentioned percentages of, is a percentage of the total development costs? Correct, yes. And we talk about the whole point around senior, mezzanine, and other forms of equity. I wanted to ask about this whole point around first and second charge, because each form of equity requires a different form of priority in terms of repayment. Are you able to just briefly explain what first charge is, second charge is, and what a deal of priority is?
Sure. So first of all, from the first charge, it's essentially recourse. And whatever, if you think about it in simple terms, if something goes wrong, what happens? And so the first charge of property essentially is just saying that whatever happens, you have ownership or you have control of the site in the first instance, and you are repaid first if anything goes wrong.
Yeah.
So for example, if you have first charge, so a senior lender typically would have first charge on a property. And so if in the event the development went awry, the senior lender, in terms of the total development cost or total value that they have lent, will be able to get repaid first in the first instance, whether you have to go and sell the property or however you get to a liquidity event.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second charge essentially just next in line, who gets paid after the first charge has been dispatched. And so in some cases that could be equity, that could be another peer-to-peer lender,
Yeah.
that could be a mezzanine lender, and essentially again that's why from a returns perspective the second charge will always cost more than the first charge, because it's more risk. So you're getting compensated for that risk that you're taking.
Yeah, and I'm very glad that you mentioned around the first charge and second charge and how that relates, because the second charge, there is no guarantee that they're going to get their money back.
Correct.
Because they've got a first charge, and that person may take all their money and there's nothing left. So I'm glad that you explained that. And then perhaps you can just briefly explain from your perspective what a deed of priority is.
Yeah, sure. So a deed of priority is essentially a piece of a legal document which stipulates who's going to get paid first and where they rank. Obviously, if you're ranked first, you're going to get repaid first, second, and equity last generally. But it's a bit more than that as well, where it sort of explains, logistically what happens. If someone did, for example, default on the loan, the second charge lender, for example, they could step in if they wanted to as well. And it can be a very complicated document if you let lawyers have their way.
Mm-hmm.
No doubt these things can go up to like 40, 50 pages, and I've seen intercredited deeds which are, almost 100 pages long. And so
Wow.
it can get, it depends how many parties you have in it, but it literally goes to the nth degree and tells you logistically, if this happens, what happens here, and how to calculate profits and whatever else as well. So, but basically it's a guidelines of how the loan is structured and what happens in certain events.
Yeah, so I think it's just important to note that development finance is very complex, and there's a lot of point around investment and understanding finances as well as the legal elements. And these deed of priorities, again, you just have to be very mindful what you're entering into when you're doing development finance. But before we move on to the next question, I wanted to understand this whole point around personal guarantees, because myself and Ray had a very extensive conversation about the importance of it and the whole element of liquidity of having assets in the event of the worst case scenario. So Kazim, do you mind just explaining the basics of personal guarantee and how much percentage do you need of a loan for your developer to be able to guarantee?
Sure. So this is a personal guarantee essentially just means that, again, in the event something goes wrong, how much and what percentage of you personally is on the hook. So if in the event, for example, and to answer your question, it could range from anywhere from 10 to 30% of the loan amount that you need to, or the total project amount that you need to secure as collateral. And so if in the example you have a 10 million development, you go to the bank, you get a loan, and they require you as a senior lender, as Ray may require, they require you to provide a personal guarantee. It essentially means that if in the event the development goes wrong, you will have to guarantee, whether it's your stocks, your house, whatever investments that you have, a percentage so that that amount is on the line when it comes to repaying the debt.
Yeah, and it's important to note that, because a lot of people think that development is a situation where it's guys getting rich, not knowing that they are putting their family's well-being at risk financially. But there's another bit that me and Ray, when we spoke about it, around putting your personal home up for personal guarantee, and you had an opinion on that and how certain banks approach people putting their personal home as a personal guarantee. Do you mind sharing a bit about what we discussed?
No, not at all. So I think there's a bit of a reputational risk here as well for banks, right? So yes, you've got all your personal assets on risk here because you've given a personal guarantee in order to take out this particular loan. But banks don't want to be seen as taking houses off people and kicking people out of, families out of homes. So a lot of the time, the equity within your home is actually discounted. In terms of, and obviously your personal net means would need to be sufficient to cover the guarantee as well, because there's no point in having £1 million guarantee, but actually you're only worth 500 grand. There's no point in having £1 million guarantee if that was the case. But so that's one consideration as well. But again, different lenders have different criteria as well. But typically, banks are regulated entities, and they typically would consider treating customers more fairly than more sort of peer-to-peer lenders or debt funds, for example.
Yeah, and that's very helpful to know. And it's just in case you've got a lot of people that own a lot of properties, or they think their home's got £500,000 thinking they can get into development. But as you've mentioned, a responsible lender would not be comfortable calling in that your personal home, and obviously the negative press that comes with that. But I know
it's quite rare as well where people actually get to that stage. The guarantee is more to bring people around the table. It's skin in the game. If things do go south and don't go according to plan, it's just there as a backup, so you can call them around the table and let's have a discussion how we can solve the problem, maybe inject a bit more equity in, how you need to raise a bit more capital from wherever else. So it's just keeping people still interested even if things don't quite work out, and we can have a resolution, because fundamentally we're bankers and lenders, we're not builders.
No, thanks for that. And Kazim, I think from your perspective, obviously we're talking about it from a regulated bank's point of view. We're now going to talk about it from a capital point of view. In your view, have you ever seen that type of a person put their home as a personal guarantee and anyone call in that loan in the event of things going wrong?
So not quite. So just a bit of context. What I do on a day-to-day basis, generally dealing with funds and dealing with ultra high net worth individuals or property companies. And so the minimum amount that I'm typically dealing with is 10, 15, 20 million of loan. Which essentially means that unless you're a mega billionaire, but that being said, one of our clients, a loan that we helped arrange a couple of months ago, a PG was called. It was 20% of the gross development value, and I mean this is an ultra high net worth individual, so. The development is still going on. The likelihood that gets called on is probably low, because he's structured in a way that has different propcos across different developments, and so if in the event that something did go wrong, you'd be able to pull equity from various different sources, and it wouldn't particularly go to the person's house, because these people typically have more assets, or they are developers and they have more assets and more developments and more property companies that they can draw equity from.
Yeah, and that is helpful. And I think what Kazim, as well as Ray have mentioned, is around structured finance. I think it's just important that there are key principles of structured finance, and I think a lot of people that do leverage buyouts understand similar principles. And it's just important that there is a strong relationship between investment banking, I would say, and property lending or property investing in that realm that we're discussing. So the next question is around due diligence, and I wanted to understand what type of due diligence, just very briefly, what type of due diligence do you typically carry out on an individual that wants to lend from your bank?
I think in the initial stages it's more about what we do in-house is more about the developer, I suppose, more about the track record, the history, what experiences they have, and then once it gets credit approved, then we'll move into sort of getting paid professionals involved, so valuers, monitoring surveyors, and legals as well, just to sort of ensure that we can try and mitigate all risks.
Okay, thank you. And from your perspective, because I know Ray works for a bank, you work for an intermediary of sorts, what would you say your due diligence is more stringent, or would you say you go through a tougher vetting process so you can present the best to your banks or ultra net worth investors?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's more stringent. I mean, every client that comes in, you have to do your KYC. Because as a...
KYC means?
Know your customer.
Cool. And that's just a process or checklist to establish source of funds, they are who they say they are, etc. Yeah.
And it's not sanctioned. They're not getting their money, for example, from Russia at the moment, which is going on, which is not, unfortunately, a helpful capital to have currently, or any of the other sanctioned countries on the planet. And so from our perspective, I mean, we will do our checks as well to make sure that the developer or the high net worth individual or the company is an entity of substance to be able to borrow. And typically with developments, it always comes into the check that you're writing, right? So if you're doing a £10 million development, £20 million development, and even if you're going 80% of the capital stack in terms of borrowing, you still need to provide the 20%, which means that for you to be able to have 20% of your 10 or 20 million, you still need to have capital, i.e. you have to be an entity of substance. So typically, I mean, I guess fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, to be able to beat in that game, there's a level of KYC that has already been done. And then most of the cases, it kind of flies through the bank's processes where they, once we've placed the developer into a bank like Ray's, then they would, once they've signed the term sheet, they will start the process of KYC checks and make sure that they are who they say they are and they can perform. Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. And then, go ahead, Ayo.
I was going to say, so that's checks obviously on the customer.
Yes.
Ray talked briefly on obviously appointing a monitoring surveyor after it's gone through credit and valuation, which is more so just more due diligence on the actual project itself. So just ensuring that the developer, the customer, their assumptions that they've based their whole proposal on make sense. So first of all, you look at the valuation. You know, at the end of this scheme, it's going to be worth X, and it's getting an independent valuer to look at that and just verify for the fund, for the intermediary. And then there's also the monitoring surveyor, so that's looking more so at the form of contract, looking more so at the scheme itself, making sure that the numbers stack up, and that's where I'll be involved. So that's more so on the actual project. So the scrutiny, one on the customer, then the next is the scrutiny on the actual project. And
that this kindly leads me to the next question around, I'll probably ask it to yourself first, Ayo, and then I will ask if Ray can answer it as well after. So the question is, what is the importance of a monitoring surveyor, and why do developers get their borrowed money in arrears? If you can answer that. So maybe the arrears part, you probably can explain that, if that's all right. But tell us the importance of a monitoring surveyor and why you feel a monitoring surveyor is very critical to effectively safeguarding the investment made by banks, capital, etc.
It's interesting because I remember when I first started in monitoring surveying, the specific kind of role, and it was very much so where banks were a bit more stringent, and I think there was a few more checks, and I say that because I remember appearing on site or asking developers for information, and they'd been working with the banks for about 10 years, for example, and never really needed a monitoring surveyor. So it was new to them, but the reason we were there is really just to, like I say, it's due diligence on the actual project. So it's ensuring, what we find is developers tend to be over optimistic on the valuations in terms of what they think they're going to achieve, and then also over optimistic on the costs, right? So the costs are normally a lot lower, or tend to be as low as possible as they think they can get, but then they always over estimate on the valuation. So we're there just as a check, just making sure that one is the contractor team capable. Have they done this before? Is the contractor, the design team, so the professionals that are working, have they got a track record? Have they done this kind of thing before? And also just highlighting any risks, any key risks. Have they got planning? Are there key planning considerations that need to be taken into place, and then crucially on cost as well, just scrutinising the contract sum that's been agreed, and any caveats that may be there. So my job really is there to advise the bank and put my PI on the line to satisfy that.
Because I think that in addition to the role of a monitoring surveyor, you're going to go for a build program. So if I wanted to borrow 100 million, it's not going to be given to me at once. It's going to be given to me in tranches. Now, before I give that explanation, I would like you to answer, Ray, around the whole point around why do you pay developers in arrears?
So it's all about risk, I suppose, fundamentally. And I think banks have been burnt before when they haven't had monitoring surveyors in place. You know, I've been told a story. So monitoring surveyor will be there on a monthly basis to make sure, you know, they're essentially their ears on the ground, eyes and ears on the ground, where they see the progress comes up. But when the bankers would typically go out maybe every other month, maybe once every quarter, something like that, to make sure it's in line with expectations and is going according to plan. But fundamentally, it's, you know, I've had horror stories when I was working at high street banks where surveyors have been cahoots with the developer, and actually they've said they've built to a certain stage, but actually when the banker goes out there, it's just a hole in the ground. There's nothing there. So, you know, stuff like this does happen, and it's always important for the bankers to go out and obviously visit the site there and make sure things are secure and everything else, especially given today where material prices are at the moment. It's very essential. And then answering your latter part of your question about arrears, it's just minimising our risk, I suppose, because we pay in arrears because you like to think your developer can float 1 month's worth of build. You know, it's additional buffer for ourselves as well, you know, if things go wrong. But at the same time, it's minimising risk in case the developer doesn't run it. You know, they ordered a big timber frame deposit, we paid it all out in advance. If something goes wrong, you know, we can, at least they've got some more cash in it than and it's not with the banks, I suppose, than the run with the bank's money. Yeah. That's always the risk, and making sure and try and minimise our risk wherever we can.
Yeah,
it does tend to also follow the payment sequence in construction, right? So normally developers are paid a month after the work is done. So, you know, if it's interim payments, it'd be 28 days after the work is done. Someone would come on site, value the works, and produce a certificate. So it effectively also follows the sequence of construction, and that's where a monitoring surveyor would again come out on the bank's behalf and check it, like we say, a month at a time. I guess the key thing we're always looking at, and when you say looking at arrears, is more so the cost to complete. Just always ensuring that there's enough left in the development facility to complete the job. You know, that's a crucial.
And I think it's just important to know, because a lot of people think that you can imagine if you've got £100 million development, your first bill is going to be $1 million after month one. Yeah. Some people feel, because I've got the development finance, I don't need to have £1 million liquid in my pocket. There's two ways that some people structure it. They may go and speak to a builder and say, can you absorb these costs and accept that we're going to pay you 1 month in arrears, or you're just going to have the money on you. So I think it's just important for people to understand that development finance, you can't have a no money down situation. It's either you're a good negotiator or you've got a lot of money around you. So you just need to bear that in mind.
Also, just to add to that, I think that typically there are two ways that this could be funded. Equity first, i.e. the person who is the developer, for example, puts in all their money in and then the bank funds the rest of it. Mm-hmm. Or pari passu, which essentially means that the bank will say fund 50% and the equity will fund the rest on each IPD, which is interest payment date, or each development drawdown date. Obviously, if you're putting your equity first from a returns perspective of the developer, that is riskier for you, but it's obviously better for the bank because all your security is already in the project. Mm-hmm. If it's pari passu, your returns will be better because you're putting in money as the bank is putting money. So it's just like the time value of money, right? Like your money out is always cheaper, I would say, than the money in the future. So most banks, and depending on where you are in terms of the size of the project, the kind of fund you are, the quality of the developer, i.e. if you're someone, say like Galliard, for example, you can in some cases be able to negotiate where you can fund pari passu. Whereas, you know, in terms of experience, if it's a less experienced developer, or in some cases even some banks won't do it. They will require you to put in the equity before they fund anything for going forward.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I've got a friend at Galliard, George. But I think that I think that there's a general point around contract management for AJAYI, and it's just a lot of people, you know, this whole thing around paying in arrears. This isn't a principle that everyone should just follow for development finance. I think it should follow and transcend everything you do as a development professional. So, AJAYI, do you want to just briefly explain the importance, even if it's not through development finance, but generally why it's important to make sure that your consultants, contractors are being paid in arrears?
Yes. Okay. So if you follow one of the the standard forms, you know, be it a JCT, be it a NEC contract. You know, there are different payment methods, and if you've got an interim payment date, it'll be as I mentioned previously. So the works are assessed on a set date, usually 28 days after the contract is signed on each month. So the beauty there is you're only paying for the works that have been done. It's really important to do that. I know that when other, you know, developers, smaller developers don't use that form and use maybe a bespoke contract, there's a lot of pressure from contractors to pay money up front. You know, pay me 20% up front. You know, I've heard of scary instances where it's even larger.
And that's season 2.
That's season 2. But the risk there is obvious, right? So you've paid in advance of the works actually being done. In the risk that the contractor becomes insolvent, you're at risk. You've got no recourse back, really. So that's one of the reasons why you may want to do that. And there's other payment methods. You know, you could do it by a milestone payment. You could do it via right at the end, so turnkey effectively.
Alright, so we're just gonna try and get through some bullet questions, and I wanted to understand. It's very important to just quickly reiterate that contract management is not only specific to development finance. I'm just gonna have to keep repeating that because a lot of people tend to get that wrong. Good contract management happens throughout the whole development process, sales process, and everything you do in life. Do not allow people to hold on to your money without them doing something that they haven't done. So this video man that's behind the camera, I paid him in advance, yeah? But should I have done it? I shouldn't have. But in reality, what I'm saying is in construction and development, that should not happen. But the next question I have today is, and it's mainly for Ray and Kazim, and this is, what happens when things go terribly wrong? And the things that go wrong is values are, so let's say at a particular moment in time, everyone knows the definition of valuation. When you get to the final GDV, it was assessed at a certain amount and it's gone down by 50%. And now the developer is in a tricky situation, or when costs go up or the builder becomes insolvent. In your view, and very briefly, because we've got one more question, what happens?
So when things go wrong, I mean, inevitably in a high risk game, things, you know, don't always go according to plan, and that is why that's why you structure. That's why you have lawyers draft and write up contracts. That's why you have first charge. That's why you have second charge. So frankly speaking, if things go wrong, whether costs go up and there's your cost overrun, or the well has dried up, one or two things will happen, or the values have plummeted, i.e. you're not being able to sell the development or the property for what you thought you would. One or two things will happen. Either you need to inject more cash equity, or you can walk away. And if you walk away, then the lender has a whether it's a half constructed development on their hands, which they need to work out, and if it's a first charge, for example, the value, and this is where it's very important where you structure your deals, because if you're highly levered, and what that means is if the capital stack that we talked about before, if most of the money is debt, it means that you have very little equity in, you become in bigger trouble because there's no headroom. There's no allowance for things to go awry. So what would happen is you potentially could lose your investment and the bank will then be in control. Obviously, and speaking for Ray, and I'm sure he'll speak for himself, that's not really what banks are in the business of doing. It's not, most lenders do not want that to happen because they're not necessarily loaned to own people. They want the development to go well, they want to be able to be paid, and they can walk away. So in some cases, what would happen is that whether the site gets auctioned, if the developers walked away, or you get refinanced.
Thanks for watching the Property Development Book Club. Push the like button and subscribe as well.
I'm ADEWOLE ADEMOLAKE, founder at ADEMOLAKE, which specialises in property development and development management. We are sponsoring the first season of the Property Development Book Club podcast, which will be out on all platforms soon. Yeah.
Hopefully we'll never get to that stage where you'd lose 50% of your value, because this is why we do so much due diligence beforehand to make sure stuff like that doesn't happen. But we are living in crazy times at the moment where anything is possible. So in the eventuality that does happen, we'll try and look for other avenues to try and exit. If the sales aren't forthcoming, maybe try and rent it out instead, or maybe try and do Airbnb or something else like that. But the onus will be on the developer, borrower, to try and either A, inject more equity in. If the worst comes to the worst, then you'd have to call in receivers and get them involved and try and auction off this half-built site or whatever else it may be. But fundamentally, the bank may even have to take a hit in the worst case scenario. It has happened before, and
2009, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where, again, PGs, and again, very rarely does it happen, because you shouldn't ever get to that stage, but you can call in their PGs and try and personal guarantees, try and get equity from their other assets where they may have.
Well, they're limited only to the 20% that's mentioned.
Yeah, exactly.
So they can cover the 20%. They're scot-free.
I suppose. Yeah, I mean, they still have. I mean, because obviously you would have eaten up your profits, your buffer. The banks are only up, for example, we'd only lend up to 65-70% anyway. So you'd have to lose quite a lot of value and also the profits, and then obviously at 20% as well, for example. So it's a hell of a loss if you've got to that stage and you call them on, try and call in their buy-to-lets or whatever else it is, or trying to get them to sell their car to try and repay your loan.
Wow.
Talking about crazy times, obviously we've just had the massive spike of inflation and increasing costs of materials and labour, and that's why it's really important, the relationship between the fund and the monitoring surveyor, but also more so the monitoring surveyor and the developer being able to be open, because what I found is, when developers tend to try and hide and just try and deal with the situations themselves, it always leads to a problem. If we find out and they're open, and banks are, as Ray just said, actually they want you to finish the development, right? They want to get their return back, and in most cases they will work with you and try and find ways to support you. So the key thing is communication. If I know early enough, we can have the conversation, and it tends to resolve itself.
Yeah, so I think it's just important to know, firstly, things can go wrong, and this is where it is important for a developer like myself, and the person sitting over there, to just bear in mind that we have to consider multiple exits. And multiple exits is, are you developing to sell those units to to obviously return your loan, or you may refinance it and make it into a larger buy-to-let type arrangement so you can rent it out. And I think you mentioned that. So it's just important that if you're working in a development, is in our best practice within our professions to ensure that you have at least 3 or 4 exits. Another exit that some people do is they sell the homes to a housing association just to get themselves out of a hot and sticky situation. So it's just important to note that exits are very, very important. And I think we've got a grenade. He's gonna. I knew he was gonna do it. It's in his character. We got a grenade, and we're just gonna have a very quick explorative conversation. And I briefly discussed it with him, and I think I know what his response is. He might have changed his mind. Who knows? But the question is, what is more important, finding deals or access to capital? What do you think?
So this is a very interesting grenade, and the reason is, today, and Ray mentioned it earlier, capital has never been wider, i.e. people are looking for returns. Over the pandemic, there's a statistic in how wealth grew across the US, and the rich got richer essentially because they had more capital. So in English, there's dry powder, and what that means is a lot of money that people want to deploy, i.e. to give and to get returns back. And so I always think that it's important to have a combination of the right team beside you, because if you have the right team, i.e. you have access to the deals, then the money can get you your return. If you have money and you have no deals, you're just burning a hole in your pocket. And eventually, over time, especially in an inflationary, during an inflationary environment that we're in right now, that value of your investment or value of cash is actually going down. So I think it's very important to have access to capital, And I think that if you have access to capital, you're more likely to be able to find good people and good deals. Whereas if you have great deals and you have no money, you can't do anything. That's my view.
I would disagree with that.
I would hope so.
You can, again, if you're willing to pay and the deal stacks up, you can get 100% funding out of there. It is possible. You'd be paying through your nose for it, but it is possible. So if the deal, if you have the right person that can structure a deal and make it work, or actually if you go out and do the old-fashioned way and try and get planning consent yourself, you don't necessarily need too much money to get that going. If you're going to have option agreements or whatever else, you can get planning gain, and a lot of banks now in London, lenders will take planning gain into consideration as equity. So that is, so I'd probably say having the right deals. Because there's so much equity out there at the moment, and the wall of capital, it's not too hard to get 100% funding these days. It is doable, but again, it's finding the right deal to make sure it all stacks up and it's still profit for everyone to make and keep everyone happy.
Someone's got a question, but
no, because what Ray keeps saying is you're right. It's about the right deal, but there's several wrong deals out there. So you could have a deal and go out and get capital, but no one will give you the money for it because the deal just doesn't work. So I think there's a balance between the both. I don't think it's one or the other.
It's both.
Yeah.
A bit of both.
Yeah.
What do you think, Aya? Do you think money or the deals are more important?
Oh, Hannah just stole my thunder. Exactly that. It's a bit of both. I think finding the right deal, and I say that because everyone's chasing, and actually I don't think there's ever been a time when the common man, I say, people that aren't professionals are aware of the power of property, the power of development, and everybody is interested in getting involved. So it's harder to find these deals. So the right deal, I think, is key because, as we've said, there are many other funding opportunities. So a bit of both, but I think the deal at this moment in time.
Yeah, I thought grenading, but everyone seems to survive that grenade, obviously. But I think it's just important to note that the reason I thought I'd ask that question.
What's your view first?
I can't give my opinion because I'm the host.
No, you have to give your opinion.
Okay, my basic opinion is this. I feel that like developers are hunters, yeah, and we have to go out there like lions. We may or may not found the antelope, but we have to go out there. No, but the reason
What's
I said
the answer?
so the answer in short is I think finding the deals is I think that's more important because like speaking for myself, and I would like to also speak for Hannah as well to a degree, because we are property development professionals and we manage schemes at scale, yeah, through all of the details. Someone, if I was able to find an opportunity and I believe it made money, there is a 99.9% chance that it is going to make money. So me saying to an investor, I have this expertise, I found this opportunity, and I've been doing this for 10 years. I just need you to plug your money into this. You don't need to think about anything because it's already thought about. I reckon I think that is more important, being able to obviously find an opportunity and present it and do it that way. So that's why I feel that finding a deal is better. But on the flip side, I do have an appreciation for capital because in Kazim's, what we discussed earlier is if you have capital, what that does is you could always pay someone to go and find new deals. And they will go out there if they're incentivized financially. So I think it depends on what angle you're looking at it. I'm an entrepreneur, ALIC, it's a serious matter, and this whole option agreement that you discussed and everything, I think that maybe it's because of where I am at the moment, but again, it's just important to note that I think that 50-50, clearly.
I mean, for sure, there's no question that the right deal is incredibly important. I think where I'm coming from a capital point of view, is the right capital. So in an option agreement that you talked about, you don't even have to put any money. If you find a great deal and someone says to you, you know what, I'm going to find it. However, I've seen situations where people have gone with structuring with someone, with a financier, and I kind of alluded to earlier, it's a loan to own. So the interest that they're charging you is so high that there is no chance you have to be able to repay back, and they will then take the asset from you because they've structured it in a way to do that. And so having access to capital, not necessarily capital, access to capital, the right team around you that has the ability to work with the money that you have and the deals that you're finding is what will then give you that ultimate benefit. It's the access.
Yeah, and I think that raises a good point around predatory individuals, yeah, and people preying on the weak. So someone like myself or otherwise, or another small developer, they can go out there with the best of intent to say, I'm going to be a developer, but there's someone out there that knows a bit more about how to structure things, to structure it to your failure so they can have the benefit. So it's just important to note that people with money are very intelligent people, and when you're doing these types of arrangements, if you don't have capital, you just need to be very mindful of the legal agreements, and I think, Kazim, you've raised that. So I think as a final question, I just wanted to ask, in your view, what's the barriers for small developers getting into property development if they are professionals but they don't have equity? What do you think the barriers and opportunities are? Very briefly, I'll ask you to ask the same, and then we'll conclude this topic today.
Yeah, I think Ray hit the nail on the head, right? Like, the barrier is access to the right deals, access to the right capital. I think that if you're, as you mentioned, an entrepreneur, and you're hungry and you're able to go out, find and structure something, even just from a development point of view, nothing to do with the finance, and you have, because there's so much capital out there and different ways to structure things where you don't even have to put much money down as an investment. You could either go for planning, you could spend, a bit of money with the plan, getting the planning together, and also that sort of value uplift will be the sweat equity. You can find people who can fund it, or the 100% of the cost. So for a small developer, I think that the smart thing is surrounding yourself with the right people, with the right team, with the right advisors across different aspects of the whole property development cycle. And once you've done that, I think the sky's the limit. Perfect.
I really appreciate that. And this is what the property development book seeks to do: bring together professionals. And this is exactly what we do. But Ray, have you got an opinion on what the opportunities and the barriers are for new entrants into property development?
It's going to be getting your first deal away, to be fair, and getting the if you can't finance it yourself, it's because there's always going to be a risk for someone, especially with it being your first deal. So I think you're going to have to. It's predominantly trying to raise capital initially. I think 100% funding is okay if you've done it before and you have a good track record, but actually, if you haven't done it before, no one's going to give you 100% funding. So I think it's getting that first deal away, and that first step is always going to be the hardest. So I suppose to try and circumnavigate that, maybe doing refurbs to begin with or something like that first, rather than going for straight up new build, or if you're like a contractor background, for example, maybe again a smaller deal you're going to start off with rather than going in too big. Or alternatively, if you're lack of experience, money can make up for it. So if you're only 50% geared, a bank might be more willing to take a chance on a newer developer if you're relatively lowly geared. So that's probably my opinion.
Okay. So today we've spoken about property development finance, joined by Kazim from BBS, Ray from Paragon Development Finance, and Ayo from Chorus, who's a monitoring surveyor. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, share and subscribe. Follow these guys. They are excellent professionals, and we look forward to hearing from you in the next season.